In October of 1859, a black boy was carried onto a stage in Savannah, Georgia, and seated in front of a grand piano he had never formally been taught to play. He was 11 years old. He had never spoken a single word. And within 90 seconds the audience was screaming. White men who owned plantations leaned forward in their seats. Women pressed gloved hands to their mouths. A preacher stood and whispered that what they were witnessing was not of God. The boy's fingers moved faster than any trained pianist in the South. He played 3 compositions at once, a military march with his left hand, a waltz with his right, and a humming vibration produced by striking the wood of the piano with his foot. When the piano lid was slammed shut, he continued playing on the table, perfectly recreating every note. By the end of the night, 7 men fainted. 2 physicians argued publicly over whether the boy's mind was damaged or divine, and a contract was signed that would earn more money than most plantations produced in a year. The white society of Savannah was scandalized, but they had no idea what was really happening, because the boy was not performing music. He was recording it. Every sound he had ever heard, every scream, every whip crack, every prayer whispered by enslaved people at night. And what none of them knew, what they would not understand for decades, was that Thomas Wiggins was not silent because he could not speak. He was silent because no one had ever asked him anything worth answering. By the time the Civil War began, Thomas would generate the modern equivalent of millions of dollars. By the time it ended, he would legally own nothing, not even his name. What really happened inside the mind of the boy they called a miracle? Who controlled him? And what did Thomas do, without ever speaking, that terrified the men who claimed to own him? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. In the spring of 1849, when the Chattahoochee River ran high and brown from weeks of rain, a black child was born into a world that had already decided what he would never be. The cabin sat low to the ground, its roof sagging like a tired spine, Spanish moss hanging from nearby trees like funeral shrouds. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, iron, and fear. Outside, cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, white and endless, as if the land itself were trying to erase everything darker than it. The child did not cry. That was the first thing the women noticed. They waited. They leaned closer. They counted breaths. "He breathing," one whispered, fingers trembling against the baby's chest. "But he ain't making no sound." His mother, Charity, lay exhausted on the straw pallet, her hands still slick with blood. She reached for him slowly, afraid of what she might find. When she pulled him close, he opened his eyes, wide, dark, unblinking. Watching. Not confused. Not searching. Watching. "What wrong with him?" another woman asked. Charity did not answer. She pressed her ear to the child's chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heart. Too calm. Like he had arrived already knowing how this world worked. When the overseer was told, he came reluctantly, annoyed at the interruption. He stood in the doorway, hat still on his head, eyes narrowing as he looked at the silent infant. "Does it cry?" "No, sir." "Does it move?" "Yes, sir." He watched the baby's fingers twitch against Charity's skin, tapping softly. A pattern. 3 taps. Pause. Then 4. "Ha," the man muttered. "Probably defective." That word would follow the boy for years. A doctor was summoned 2 days later, a white man with careful hands and no patience. He prodded the baby's limbs, shined a light into his eyes, snapped his fingers inches from the child's face. Nothing. "He does not respond normally," the doctor said. "Likely simple-minded. Best suited for labor if he survives childhood." "Can he speak?" the overseer asked. The doctor shrugged. "I see no reason he would. Some minds are empty vessels." Charity stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood what it meant when white men stopped seeing a child and started seeing a problem. That night, after the others slept, she noticed something strange. The rain began again, tapping against the roof. The wind moved through the trees, bending branches, rattling loose boards. Charity lay awake, listening the way enslaved people learned to listen, to footsteps, to tone, to danger. The baby lay beside her, eyes open. His fingers moved in time with the rain. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. When thunder rolled, his body stiffened, not in fear but in attention. When it passed, his fingers adjusted, matching the echo. Charity's breath caught. "Thomas," she whispered, naming him softly, unsure why. "You hearing that, ain't you?" The child did not answer. But his fingers never stopped moving. By the time Thomas was 3, the plantation had learned to ignore him. He did not speak. He did not play with the other children. He did not cry when struck, nor laugh when praised. Instead, he listened. He listened to the bells that marked the workday, to the rhythm of hooves on dirt roads, to the cadence of hymns drifting from the white church on Sundays, to screams that came at night and were never discussed in daylight. None of it passed through him. It stayed. Charity noticed first that he remembered sounds better than faces. He would turn his head before a wagon appeared. He would begin tapping before the bell rang, seconds early, every time. Once, a visitor arrived at the main house, a woman from Savannah, her voice sharp and quick. That night, Thomas reproduced her speech perfectly, not the words but the rise and fall, the impatience embedded in every syllable. He hummed it quietly, rocking back and forth. Charity covered his mouth in terror. "Stop," she whispered. "You cannot do that." He did not resist. He did not understand. His eyes remained fixed on the wall, where shadows moved like ghosts. What Charity did not know, what none of them knew, was that Thomas was not choosing what to remember. He was incapable of forgetting. By the time he was 5, he was moved into the main house. Not because he was useful, because he was unsettling. The mistress of the house complained that the boy stood too still, that he watched too closely, that sometimes late at night she could swear she heard music coming from nowhere at all. The master agreed to keep him close where he could be observed. That decision would change everything. Thomas slept near the parlor, where the piano stood polished and waiting. He listened as white fingers pressed ivory keys in uneven patterns, mistakes repeated night after night. He listened as guests drank and laughed and argued about money, about land, about whether slavery would last forever. He listened when voices dropped low. And though he never spoke, something inside him began arranging the world differently, not by sight, not by meaning, but by sound. Years later, men would claim that Thomas Wiggins was born broken. They were wrong. He was born open, and the world poured itself into him without mercy. This was only the beginning. What they had placed inside that silent child would soon return to them, note by note, memory by memory, whether they were ready or not. And none of them were. The main house never truly slept. Even at night, when lamps were lowered and voices softened, sound leaked through its walls the way heat does through brick. The groan of floorboards. The distant cough of a drunk guest. The soft clink of crystal glasses being set down with care. To most, these noises blended into a single presence, the house breathing. To Thomas, they arrived as separate things, each demanding attention. He lay on a narrow pallet near the parlor, eyes open, staring at the darkened ceiling. The piano stood only a few feet away, its long body catching the moonlight through tall windows. It smelled faintly of polish and old wood. Sometimes, when the night was quiet enough, it creaked on its own, the wood settling, strings tightening with the cool air. Thomas listened. During the day, the house filled with voices that did not belong to him. The mistress's footsteps were light but sharp, heels striking the floor in quick, irritated bursts. The master moved differently, slow, heavy, his boots announcing authority long before he entered a room. Their arguments followed patterns Thomas learned without trying. Rising tension. Pause. Then the release, either laughter or cruelty. He catalogued it all. In the afternoons, when the mistress practiced the piano, Thomas sat in the corner, forgotten. She was not a skilled player. She struck keys too hard, rushed passages meant to breathe, repeated the same mistakes day after day. When she stopped, frustrated, Thomas's fingers twitched against his leg, completing what she could not finish. Once, without looking at him, she said, "Stop that." He froze instantly. Her tone carried more fear than anger. She did not understand why. At meals, Thomas listened to silverware scrape plates and memorized the cadence of conversation. He learned which topics made voices sharpen. Money, abolition, the future. He learned which words caused silence to fall suddenly, like a dropped curtain. At night, when enslaved people moved quietly through the house to clean, Thomas tracked them by sound alone. He knew Charity's steps without seeing her. He knew when she was tired by the way her feet dragged. When she passed him, she sometimes brushed her fingers over his hair, quick and careful, as if afraid the house itself might object. "You behaving?" she whispered once. Thomas tapped twice on the floor. "Yes." She smiled, then stiffened when a floorboard creaked overhead. What Charity did not know was that Thomas already knew who was awake upstairs. He knew by the rhythm of breathing through the vents. He knew when someone turned in their bed. He knew when the master lay awake, staring into the dark, thinking thoughts that carried weight even without words. The piano became his anchor. He never touched it at first. He only listened. When guests played, when the mistress practiced, When someone banged keys drunkenly after midnight, Thomas absorbed it all. Notes layered themselves inside him, not as melodies but as structures, patterns of pressure and release. One afternoon, a visiting cousin noticed the boy sitting unnaturally still. "Does he ever do anything?" the woman asked, fanning herself. "He is harmless," the mistress replied. "Simple." As if summoned by the word, Thomas rocked slightly, a low hum vibrating in his chest. It matched the pitch of the last note played hours earlier. The woman frowned. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "Nothing," she said, uneasy. "Probably the house." That night, the master drank with friends. Their laughter grew louder, more reckless. One man stumbled toward the piano and began pounding keys in a crude imitation of a march. The others clapped and shouted encouragement. Thomas sat upright. When the man finished, gasping, Thomas moved closer to the piano without realizing he had done so. His fingers hovered inches above the keys. Someone laughed. "Look at him. Thinks he can play." Before anyone could stop him, Thomas pressed a single key. The sound cut through the room clean and exact. He pressed another, then another. Slowly at first, then with certainty, recreating the march note for note, not as it had been played but as it was meant to sound. Silence fell. The drunk man stared, mouth open. "That is not possible." The mistress stood abruptly, chair scraping. "Get him away from there." Charity rushed forward, grabbing Thomas by the shoulders. He did not resist. His fingers continued moving in the air, finishing the piece in perfect time. No one spoke for several seconds. The master cleared his throat. It was coincidence. But his eyes never left the piano. That was the night the house changed. Thomas was no longer invisible. He was watched, tested, provoked. Guests returned with friends. Men of learning were invited under the pretense of dinner. Thomas performed again and again. He never looked at the audience, never acknowledged applause. When overwhelmed, his body stiffened, his breathing shallow, his fingers tapping wildly against whatever surface was nearest. They called it a trick. They called it mimicry. They did not call it what it was, a mind operating without filters, without mercy, without rest. What none of them understood, what they would not understand until it was far too late, was that the house had not discovered Thomas. Thomas had discovered the house, and he was listening to everything it had ever tried to hide. The invitation list was longer than usual. That alone told the master something had shifted. Curiosity spread faster than fear in Savannah, and by late summer, whispers had begun to travel beyond the plantation roads. A silent boy, a piano, a performance no one could explain without lowering their voice. On the night it finally happened, the night that would later be argued over, distorted, and partially erased, the air hung heavy and wet, cicadas screaming from the trees as if warning the house of what was coming. Candles lined the parlor. Chairs were drawn closer than before. Men arrived sober and left that way. Women wore tighter smiles. Thomas sat on a stool near the wall, feet not quite touching the floor. He did not rock. He did not hum. His stillness unsettled them more than movement ever could. "Let him play," someone said quietly. The mistress hesitated. She had practiced control over the boy these past weeks. When he touched the piano, when he was removed, how long he was allowed to remain near it. Control made the impossible feel safer. "Only a few minutes," she said. Thomas was guided to the bench. He did not look at the keys. He did not need to. He placed his hands down gently as if greeting something familiar and began. At first it was simple. A melody the room recognized. Polite smiles returned. A few men nodded as if this confirmed their assumptions. Talent, yes, but explainable. Then Thomas's left hand diverged. A second melody threaded beneath the first, slower, more deliberate. A woman frowned, trying to follow it. Before she could, Thomas's right foot pressed against the wood of the piano, striking a rhythm that did not belong to either melody. 3 layers. Perfectly aligned. Someone stood abruptly. "That is enough." Thomas did not stop. His hands moved faster now, eyes unfocused, breath shallow. The room seemed to shrink around him. The candles flickered in time with the rhythm. A glass shattered somewhere, no one noticed when. "He is not looking," a man whispered. "He is not even here." The master stepped forward and slammed the piano lid shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Then Thomas's fingers continued moving across the closed lid, striking the exact positions of the keys beneath. The melody did not falter. Not one note slipped. A woman screamed. "Open it," someone said. "Open it now." When the lid was raised, the sound snapped back into the room as if it had never left. Thomas finished the piece, hands lifting together, breath shuddering out of him. He sat frozen, fingers curled, body trembling as though something inside him had broken loose and not yet returned. No one applauded. One man crossed himself. Another backed toward the door. "This is not a trick," the drunk from weeks earlier said, sober now. "I was wrong. This is something else." The mistress spoke sharply. "Enough. Take him away." Charity moved forward, her face pale. As she took Thomas's hand, she felt the tremor running through him, the heat of overstimulation burning under his skin. "It hurts," she whispered, though he did not speak. "I know." Upstairs, alone in her room, the mistress pressed her hands to her ears long after the music stopped. Downstairs, men argued in low, urgent tones. He could make a fortune. He could bring trouble. He should not be allowed near a piano again. The master listened to all of it without speaking. What none of them noticed, what none of them thought to watch, was Thomas lying awake that night, replaying the performance again and again, not as memory but as sensation. The vibrations, the gasps, the fear. He added something new to it, a sound no one had made. A low, dissonant note that did not exist on the piano. Years later, musicians would swear they heard it sometimes when they played alone. A vibration beneath the music, unsettling and familiar. That was the night Savannah learned to be afraid of a boy who could not speak. And that was the night Thomas learned that music could make powerful people lose control. It was the last lesson he would ever need. The morning after the performance, the house smelled different. It was not the scent of polish or food or damp wood, but something sharper, ink, paper, and urgency. Men arrived earlier than usual, hats in hand, voices already lowered before they crossed the threshold. Thomas sat on the floor near the parlor wall, legs folded beneath him, tracing invisible patterns on the boards with one finger. He felt it before anyone spoke. The shift. The master stood near the window, reading a letter twice, then a third time, his mouth set in a way Thomas had learned meant decisions had already been made. The mistress watched from across the room, arms crossed tightly, her gaze flicking between the boy and the door as if expecting something to escape. "He cannot remain here," she said at last. The master did not look at her. "He cannot leave either." By noon, the papers were drawn up. Thomas did not know what a contract was, but he recognized the sound of finality. The scratch of pen on paper. The careful clearing of throats. The way Charity's breathing changed when she was told to stand back. "This is for his protection," one man said. "He will be cared for." Charity stared at him. "By who?" No one answered. The man who stepped forward wore a clean coat and a smile practiced enough to be convincing. He knelt slightly so he could look Thomas in the face. "You are very special," he said gently. "You are going to travel." Thomas tilted his head. The man's voice carried confidence, but beneath it ran something else. Hunger, quick and sharp. Travel meant movement. Movement meant sound. Trains. Crowds. New rooms. Thomas's fingers began to tap. Charity grabbed his hands, holding them still. "You cannot take him." The master's voice hardened. "I can. And I will." The argument that followed was brief and meaningless. Charity's words were swallowed by law she had never been allowed to read. Thomas watched her mouth move, watched her hands shake, watched her body fold inward as if trying to make herself smaller than the moment. The man with the smile stood. "We leave tomorrow." That night, Charity did not sleep. She sat beside Thomas on the pallet, her back against the wall, her hand resting on his chest to feel his breathing. The house was quiet, but Thomas heard everything anyway, the mice in the walls, the distant thunder, the master pacing upstairs. "You listen to everything," Charity whispered. "Do you hear me?" Thomas's eyes were open. He tapped once against the floor. She swallowed hard. "They going to use you. They already are." Her voice broke and Thomas's tapping grew faster, uneven now, reflecting the rise and fall of her breath. "I do not know how to stop it," she said. "But I need you to remember something." She leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. "You belong to yourself, even if they say you do not. You hear me?" Thomas did not respond, but he memorized the sound of her voice perfectly. Every crack, every pause, every tear she tried to hide. The next morning he was taken before dawn. No ceremony, no farewell. Charity was held back by two women, her cries swallowed by the trees as the wagon pulled away. Thomas sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, the rhythm of the wheels carving itself into his mind. By the time Savannah came into view, the man beside him was already explaining the plan. "You will perform," he said. You will amaze them. And in return you will be fed, clothed, protected. Thomas stared at the passing buildings. Horses, voices, bells. And the money, the man continued, almost to himself. The money will be handled properly. Handled by whom was never specified. They arrived at a boarding house where Thomas was examined again, by doctors, by ministers, by men who smelled of cigars and ambition. They spoke over him as if he were furniture. Is he aware? Does he understand? Is it cruelty if he cannot comprehend? Thomas sat silently while a doctor clapped loudly near his ear. He does not flinch, the man said. Remarkable. That night, alone in a strange room, Thomas lay awake on a narrow bed. The walls hummed with unfamiliar sounds. He replayed Charity's voice again and again, aligning it with the rhythm of the wagon wheels, the cadence of the man's promises. Ownership, he was learning, had a sound. It was the sound of doors closing softly, of decisions made elsewhere, of names being changed without permission. By the end of the week, posters appeared. A silent prodigy, a miracle of nature, a Negro boy with powers beyond explanation. Thomas stood beside the man who now called himself his guardian, the letters large and bold above them. People stared openly. Some reached out to touch him. He did not react. What none of them knew, what they would never understand, was that Thomas had already begun to separate the sounds of praise from the sounds of control. And once he learned the difference, there would be no going back. This was not a rescue. It was a transfer. And the world was about to hear the consequences. They did not teach Thomas to play. They decided very early that teaching implied guidance, and guidance implied responsibility. What they wanted was output, something measurable, something that could be repeated on command. So they removed everything else. The boarding house became a corridor of rooms that smelled of soap and strangers. Thomas was moved often, sometimes with a day's notice, sometimes in the middle of the night. Each place had a piano. Each piano had slightly different keys, some heavier, some chipped, some tuned sharp or flat. Thomas adjusted instantly. His hands learned the difference the way skin learns heat. The man who called himself his guardian began setting rules. You play when I say, silence. You stop when I say, silence. You do not touch the instrument otherwise. Thomas sat with his hands folded, eyes unfocused, absorbing the shape of the man's voice. At first, the performances were short. 5 minutes, 10. Enough to impress without overwhelming. But audiences demanded more. They leaned forward, called out requests, argued over what the boy could or could not do. Have him play something sad. Have him play faster. Have him play 2 things at once. Thomas complied until his body began to rebel. When overstimulated, his breath shortened. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. His head rocked side to side as if trying to shake loose the excess noise trapped inside him. The guardian mistook this for disobedience. Control him, he told Charity, who had been allowed to travel with them under strict supervision. He must learn discipline. Charity knelt beside Thomas, whispering urgently. Slow. Slow. Thomas pressed his palms flat against the floor, grounding himself through vibration. It helped, but not enough. The first punishment came quietly. A hand on his shoulder. Pressure. A warning. The second came louder. A slap across the back of his head when he failed to stop playing quickly enough. Thomas did not cry. He memorized the sound instead, the hollow echo of skin on skin, the way the room reacted with sudden stillness. From then on, he played through pain. Hours at a time. Sometimes with no audience, only men watching from the corner taking notes. Doctors timed him. Ministers prayed aloud, convinced they were witnessing either a miracle or a warning. Does he tire? One asked. Not in the usual way, the guardian replied. His body does, but his mind does not. They began to test that. Thomas was played sounds he had never heard before, clocks, bells, whistles, entire orchestras squeezed into cramped rooms. They would leave him alone afterward, then return and ask him to reproduce everything. He did. Perfectly. Once, after a performance that lasted nearly 3 hours, Thomas collapsed. His hands locked into claws, muscles seizing. Charity screamed for help. The guardian frowned. He is valuable. Do not damage him. As if damage were a single visible thing. They learned quickly that Thomas could be reset. Silence helped. Darkness. Isolation. He was placed in small rooms with nothing but his breath and the faint hum of the building. When he emerged, calmer, they returned him to the piano. This became the pattern. Stimulate, extract, contain. Thomas began to understand the structure even if he did not understand the words. Music brought attention. Attention brought control. Control brought pain. But music was also the only place where the noise inside him aligned. So he played. On trains, he learned the rhythm of wheels and steam, reproducing entire journeys later on request. In hotels, he memorized the sounds of arguments through thin walls and wove them into compositions no one recognized but everyone felt. One evening, a man in the audience leaned forward, pale. "That piece," he said slowly, "that is the sound of a beating." The guardian laughed. "You imagine things." Thomas kept playing. Charity noticed the change before anyone else did. The boy no longer replayed music exactly as he heard it. He altered it, shifted it, added layers that did not exist. Fear crept into melodies, tension into harmonies. At night, when they were alone, Charity whispered, "What you hearing now?" Thomas tapped irregularly. "Too much." She held his hands, pressing them still. "You do not owe them everything." But Thomas did not know what ownership meant beyond sensation. He knew only that when he played, the noise inside him made sense. When he did not, it tore at him. The Guardian began advertising him more aggressively. A phenomenon. A wonder. A boy who hears God. Crowds grew larger. The money followed. None of it touched Thomas. He slept in borrowed rooms. He ate when told. He wore clothes chosen for him. His name began to change depending on the city. Sometimes he was Blind Tom. Sometimes simply, the boy. Once, during a performance, a woman shouted, "Does he understand us?" The Guardian answered smoothly, "He understands nothing. That is what makes it pure." Thomas's fingers faltered for half a second. In that pause, something new surfaced. Not confusion, anger. It was brief, unformed. But it lodged itself deep, vibrating beneath every note he played afterward. Years later, historians would argue whether Thomas Wiggins had emotions the way other people did. They would miss the point. He felt everything. He just had no language for mercy. And as the tours lengthened and the demands sharpened, the world around him grew louder, while the space where he could be himself shrank to the width of a piano bench. It was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. They simply chose not to stop, because the boy did not scream, and silence to them meant consent. By the winter of 1857, Thomas was no longer introduced as a child. He was presented as a phenomenon. Posters grew bolder. Language sharpened. Where once the handbills had promised curiosity, now they promised revelation. A mind beyond nature. A gift untouched by reason. Men came not to be entertained, but to be confirmed in their belief that the world still obeyed rules they understood. They were always wrong. The halls grew larger. Churches, lecture rooms, theaters that smelled of dust and old velvet. Thomas sat beneath chandeliers and gaslight, the heat pressing down on him from every direction. His guardian stood nearby, smiling, bowing, answering questions Thomas would never be asked directly. Is he aware of his talent? He does not know what talent is. Does he understand applause? No more than the wind understands trees. Thomas listened to the lie settle into the room. Applause had a shape, a weight. It struck like rain, irregular and loud. He catalogued it the way he catalogued everything else. Another sound imposed, another demand. They pushed him harder now. 3 performances a day. New cities every week. Different pianos hauled onto stages that were never quite level. The Guardian learned to watch Thomas's hands closely, to anticipate when the tremor would begin. "Not yet," he would whisper. "Give them one more." Thomas's fingers blurred. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The world narrowed to keys and vibration and breath. When the tremor became too strong, he pressed his heel into the floor, grounding himself through the building itself. The music changed. Audiences noticed before anyone admitted it. "It sounds uneasy," one man said after a performance in Charleston. "That is imagination," the Guardian replied quickly. "Genius unsettles." But the unease grew harder to dismiss. Thomas began playing pieces no one recognized. Not marches or waltzes or hymns. These compositions moved strangely, building tension without release. Notes repeated obsessively. Rhythms fractured and reassembled. A woman wept openly during one such piece, unable to explain why. Another man left the hall abruptly, pale and shaking. Doctors argued afterward, their voices sharp. "He is overstimulated. This cannot continue." "On the contrary," another said, "this is evolution. We are witnessing a new form of mind." Thomas sat between them, head bowed, absorbing every word. Their voices carried excitement, fear, possession. None of it belonged to him. The Guardian's smile thinned. The money was excellent, but the risk was growing. Fear did not always sell well. Fear invited questions. So they tried to contain the music. "Play what you are told," the guardian said firmly one night. "Do not improvise." Thomas stared at the wall. At the next performance, he obeyed. He played exactly as requested. Clean, precise, predictable. The audience applauded politely. The guardian exhaled in relief. But something had shifted. The suppression made the noise inside Thomas worse. Without release, the stored sounds pressed against his body, searching for escape. His sleep fractured. He woke tapping violently, humming tones too low to be heard but felt in the chest. Charity tried to help him regulate, guiding his hands, slowing his breath. "You do not have to give them everything," she whispered again and again. But Thomas had learned the cost of refusal. At a performance in Macon, a drunk man shouted, "Have him play what the slaves sing." The room went still. The guardian hesitated only a moment. "Very well." Thomas froze. He knew those songs. Work songs. Laments. Rhythms meant to survive pain. They were not meant for this room. He played anyway. But he did not play them as they were sung. He slowed them. Stretched the notes until the spaces between them felt unbearable. He layered in sounds from elsewhere. The crack of a whip, the thud of bodies, the low murmur of prayers whispered at night. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. A woman stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate." The guardian laughed too loudly. Art can be confronting. Thomas finished and lifted his hands. The silence afterward was absolute. That night, the guardian struck him for the first time with anger rather than control. "You humiliated me," he hissed, gripping Thomas's arm too tightly. "You embarrassed us." Thomas did not resist. He focused on the sound of his own pulse, steady beneath the chaos. What the guardian did not know, what he could not hear, was that Thomas had begun embedding memory into music deliberately. Not accidentally. Not reflexively. Intentionally. He replayed the world as it truly sounded, stripped of comfort. The monster they feared was not the boy. It was the mirror he had become. By the end of the year, rumors followed them. Stories exaggerated and twisted. Some claimed Thomas could predict death through music. Others swore he could reproduce conversations he had never heard. Attendance remained high, but the tone changed. Curiosity gave way to apprehension. Men watched him closely now, not as entertainment, but as something unstable. Thomas noticed. He noticed the way hands hovered near him longer than necessary. The way questions turned sharper. The way his guardian's voice tightened whenever someone lingered too long after a performance. Control was slipping. And when control slips, punishment follows. None of them understood that Thomas had already crossed a threshold. He was no longer merely absorbing sound. He was choosing what to return. And soon, very soon, they would hear something they could not take back. The money arrived before the truth ever could. It came folded, counted, stacked, and recorded in ledgers Thomas was never allowed to see. It arrived in envelopes thick enough to bend, in handshakes that lingered too long, in promises spoken softly so they would not sound like greed. Wherever Thomas performed, the receipts followed. Paid admissions, private exhibitions, invitations to parlors where the air was heavy with expectation and entitlement. The guardian grew careful with his smile. He learned which men needed reassurance and which needed flattery. He learned when to invoke science and when to invoke God. Above all, he learned to speak of Thomas as a thing that required management. Brilliant, he would say, but delicate. Delicate meant controlled. The first lawsuit came quietly, filed by a distant relative of the master who claimed partial ownership of the boy's earnings. The second followed within months, this one from a former partner who insisted he had been promised a share of future profits. Lawyers circled. Papers multiplied. Thomas listened to arguments through doors and walls, the rhythm of legal language grinding against itself. Ownership, custody, capacity, consent. Words that meant nothing to him individually, but together formed a sound like a cage closing. The guardian responded by tightening his grip. Thomas's schedule became rigid. His movements tracked. Charity was warned not to speak to outsiders. Performances were preceded by rehearsals that lasted too long, followed by silences that lasted longer. "You will play exactly what is requested," the guardian said one evening, his voice smooth but brittle. Nothing more. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tapping lightly against his knees. "And you will stop when told." The tapping slowed. The guardian nodded, satisfied. He did not see the tension coiled beneath Thomas's stillness, the way sound pressed outward against restraint. To protect the asset, they began changing his story. In some cities, Thomas was described as blind. In others, deaf. Sometimes both. The contradictions did not matter. Mystery sold better than consistency. His name shifted too. Blind Tom, the posters declared. Professor Tom. The musical Negro. Each name stripped something away, replacing it with spectacle. Charity protested once, quietly, when she heard a man refer to Thomas as it. He a boy, she said. He a person. The guardian did not raise his voice. He is an investment. That night, Thomas played softly, long after he was told to stop. The music crept through the boarding house, thin and unsettling, like something trying to remember itself. The guardian burst into the room. Enough. Thomas's hands froze midair. You do not get to decide, the guardian continued, his patience fraying. You will play when instructed and you will stop when instructed. Do you understand? Thomas stared past him, eyes unfocused. The guardian leaned closer. Do. Understand. Thomas nodded once. It was not agreement. It was notation. As the legal battles intensified, doctors were summoned again, men eager to pronounce judgment in exchange for access. They poked and tested, asked questions Thomas did not answer, scribbled conclusions he could not read. He lacks moral reasoning, one said. Therefore, guardianship must be absolute. Another nodded. He cannot comprehend money. Or ownership. No one asked whether he could comprehend exploitation. In private moments, Thomas began doing something new. He practiced silence. Not the absence of sound, that was impossible, but the refusal to respond. He limited his movements, reduced his tapping, saved his energy for the stage. The guardian mistook this for compliance. See, he told a lawyer. He is learning discipline. But beneath the surface, Thomas was reorganizing, cataloging not just sound but reaction. Which notes made men lean forward? Which rhythms made women uncomfortable? Which pauses caused fear to ripple through a room? He was learning power. The performances grew more controlled outwardly, but the effect intensified. Audiences left shaken without knowing why. Conversations stalled afterward. Men drank more than usual. This is not normal, someone whispered after a show in Augusta. The guardian smiled. Genius rarely is. Behind the scenes, the lawsuits reached a boiling point. Accusations flew. Contracts were challenged. Thomas's earnings were frozen, redirected, absorbed into accounts bearing other names. None of it mattered to Thomas. What mattered was the sound of Charity crying quietly one night, believing he slept. They stealing everything, she whispered into the dark. Everything you make. Thomas listened. He replayed her voice later on the piano, embedding it beneath a cheerful melody during a public performance. No one noticed. No one recognized the sound of grief hidden under brightness. But Thomas heard it, and he remembered. By the end of the year, a court date loomed. Questions of ownership would finally be addressed publicly. Doctors would testify. Lawyers would argue. Thomas would be presented as evidence. The guardian prepared carefully. You will behave, he said. You will sit quietly unless instructed otherwise. Thomas nodded. What the guardian did not know, what no one in that tightening circle of control understood, was that Thomas had already decided how he would speak. Not with words, with memory. And when the courtroom finally opened its doors, the sound that followed would not belong to any of them. The courthouse smelled of damp wool and old paper. Thomas felt it before he saw it, the weight of the room pressing inward, the layered sounds of authority. Boots on stone. Murmured conversations thick with certainty. The scrape of benches as bodies settled into places they believed were theirs by right. He sat beside the guardian, hands folded, eyes lowered. To the men gathered there, he looked small, contained. A curiosity brought into a space not meant for him. They mistook stillness for absence. The judge arrived to the rustle of movement and the clearing of throats. Lawyers rose. Arguments began almost immediately, their words sharp and rhythmic, overlapping like competing melodies. Ownership, one said. Custodianship, another countered. Incapacity, a third insisted. Thomas listened as his life was described without ever being named. He heard his worth reduced to figures, his silence reframed as deficiency. He heard men argue over what should be done with the money his hands had created. Charity sat behind him, rigid, her breathing shallow. Thomas recognized the sound of fear. It had a hollow center. The guardian leaned down. Remember, he whispered. You sit. You stay quiet. Thomas nodded. The first doctor was called. He spoke confidently, gesturing toward Thomas as if toward a diagram. The boy lacks normal comprehension, he said. His musical ability is mechanical, reflexive. There is no intent. Another doctor disagreed just as confidently. On the contrary, he exhibits extraordinary cognitive function, but without moral reasoning. He must be controlled. Controlled. The word echoed. The judge rubbed his temples. Is there any demonstration that might clarify this matter? The guardian's smile returned, quick and practiced. Of course. A piano had been brought in for that very purpose. It sat to one side of the room, its presence both absurd and inevitable. Thomas was guided to the bench. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling the unfamiliar resistance, the slight imbalance. He adjusted instinctively. What would you like him to play? The guardian asked the court. The judge hesitated. Something appropriate. Thomas began with a hymn. Simple. Recognizable. Play. The room relaxed almost immediately. A few men nodded, satisfied. This was what they expected. Talent contained within familiar boundaries. Then Thomas changed the tempo. Slowly at first. Subtly. He stretched the spaces between notes, drawing out the silences until they felt heavy, expectant. Beneath the melody he added something else. A low, repetitive pattern, barely audible but insistent. The hymn became uneasy. People shifted in their seats. A lawyer frowned, trying to identify what felt wrong. Thomas's left hand introduced a new rhythm. It was not music. It was the sound of marching feet. His right hand followed with sharp, irregular strikes. The crack of a whip. The slam of a door. The echo of a gavel hitting wood. The room stiffened. This is unnecessary, someone muttered. Thomas did not look up. He layered voices into the piece, not words but cadence. Please swallowed mid-breath. Orders barked without response. A woman's cry cut short. Charity gasped. The judge half rose from his seat. That is enough. Thomas continued. The music grew darker, denser. Sounds collided and resolved in ways that made the chest tighten. The hymn twisted into something unrecognizable, its comfort stripped away, leaving only the structure of control beneath it. A man stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly. Make him stop. The guardian rushed forward. Thomas. He did not respond. The guardian grabbed his shoulder hard. Thomas flinched, not from the touch, but from the sudden disruption of rhythm. His hands slammed down on the keys, producing a final dissonant chord that reverberated through the room like a held breath released too violently. Silence followed. Absolute. Crushing. The judge sank back into his chair, face pale. For a long moment, no one spoke. What, the judge said slowly, was that? The guardian laughed weakly. Imagination. Nerves. Thomas turned his head slightly, just enough to face the bench. For the first time, he made eye contact. It lasted less than a second. But in that second, the judge felt something he could not name. A sense of being seen too clearly, of his own voice reduced to sound, his authority stripped of meaning. The verdict came quickly after that. Thomas was declared incapable of managing his own affairs. Guardianship remained intact. Control was preserved. The courtroom emptied in uneasy silence. Outside, the city carried on. Wagons rolled. Vendors shouted. Life resumed its familiar noise. Thomas walked beside the guardian, his steps measured, his hands still. You embarrassed me, the guardian said tightly once they were alone. Do not do that again. Thomas did not respond. That night, in the small room where he slept, Thomas did not play. He sat in the dark, listening to the building settle, to the distant sounds of Savannah breathing. The music inside him had changed permanently. It no longer sought harmony. It sought truth. What the court had witnessed, though none of them would ever admit it, was not a lack of comprehension. It was intention. And from that night forward, every performance carried something new beneath the surface, a quiet accusation embedded in sound. Audiences would feel it even if they could not name it. Discomfort would follow him like a shadow. Rumors would grow sharper, darker. They would say the boy's music had turned strange, unsettling, wrong. They would never say why. Thomas lay back on his pallet, staring into the dark. The noise inside him had found its shape, and there would be no returning from it. By 1861, the sound of the country changed. Thomas noticed it before the newspapers did, before men began shouting in the streets or flags appeared in windows. The change came as a tightening, conversations clipped short, footsteps quicker, laughter edged with something brittle. Drums began to appear in public spaces. Not for music, but for instruction. War had a rhythm. It arrived in Savannah as tension first, then certainty. Soldiers marched through the streets in uneven lines, boots striking stone in patterns Thomas memorized without effort. Cannons were tested near the river, their thunder rolling through his chest long after the echo faded. The city hummed with preparation, with fear dressed up as resolve. The Guardian grew anxious. Performances became harder to arrange. Crowds thinned, then swelled unpredictably, some nights desperate for distraction, other nights too wary to gather. Money slowed. Lawsuits stalled. The careful balance of control began to wobble. "Things are changing," the Guardian muttered one night, pacing the room. "But they will not change for us." Thomas sat nearby, hands resting on his knees, feeling the vibration of distant drums through the floor. He understood change as sensation, not concept. Change meant new sounds replacing old ones. Change meant instability. Freedom was declared on paper somewhere far away. Thomas heard about it secondhand, filtered through arguments and laughter and disbelief. "They say the slaves are free now," a man scoffed during a dinner Thomas performed at reluctantly. As if paper could undo centuries. The room erupted in agreement. Thomas played through it, embedding their voices into the melody, preserving their contempt with the same accuracy he preserved hymns. When the proclamation reached Savannah in earnest, celebrations were muted, confused. Enslaved people gathered cautiously, unsure what words meant when spoken by men who had never listened to them before. Charity wept quietly when she heard. "He free," she whispered, hands shaking. "You free now." Thomas looked at her, tilting his head. Free sounded like open space. Silence. Choice. None of those things appeared. The Guardian laughed when the question was raised directly. "He belongs under guardianship. The law is quite clear." And the law agreed. Thomas was moved again, this time not for performance, but for protection. He was too valuable, the Guardian insisted, to be exposed to chaos. He was taken inland, away from the coast, into quieter towns where the war felt distant but present in every conversation. Freedom passed him like a sound muffled by walls. He remained watched, directed, scheduled. Only now the justifications changed. It is for his own good. He cannot survive alone. He does not understand the world. Thomas listened as his cage was repainted and presented as shelter. The performances resumed in smaller rooms. Private audiences. Men who paid well for reassurance that some hierarchies remained intact. Thomas played for them, the music heavy with contradiction. Hope strangled by control, liberation distorted by fear. His body began to fail more noticeably. His hands cramped after shorter periods. His joints ached. He developed a cough that lingered, shallow and persistent. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sudden surges of sound he could not shut out. Charity begged the Guardian to slow down. "He tired," she said. "You killing him." "He is strong," the Guardian replied. "Stronger than you think." Thomas heard the lie settle. In the quiet hours, when no one demanded performance, Thomas began playing only for himself. Softly. Experimentally. He recreated the sound of marching soldiers dissolving into chaos. The snap of flags in the wind. The uneven breathing of men who believed in causes until causes demanded blood. He also recreated other sounds. The moment Charity had whispered his name for the first time. The rain on the cabin roof. The rhythm of safety that had existed briefly and then vanished. Those pieces were never performed publicly. By the end of the war, the country claimed to have changed. Savannah wore new uniforms of language. Freedom. Reconstruction. Progress. Thomas's life looked exactly the same. The Guardian's hair had gone gray. His voice had sharpened with desperation. Money came slower now, but it still came, and that was enough to justify everything. One evening, after a small performance for a group of businessmen, Thomas stopped playing before he was told to. The Guardian stiffened. "Continue." Thomas did not. The room held its breath. "You will play," the Guardian said, stepping closer. Thomas turned his head slightly, listening not to the man's voice, but to the space around it. The quiet. The waiting. He pressed a single key. It was soft. Almost nothing. Then he stood and walked away from the piano. No one stopped him. Not because they respected the choice, but because, for the first time, they were unsure what would happen if they did. The Guardian said nothing until later, when they were alone. "You are becoming difficult," he said coldly. Thomas sat on the bed, fingers tapping slowly, deliberately. Difficulty had a sound. It was the sound of refusal. What none of them realized, what history would later struggle to articulate, was that Thomas Wiggins had already been free in the only way that mattered. They controlled his body. They claimed his labor. They stole his money and his name. But they no longer controlled what he returned to the world. And soon that would be impossible to ignore. The second trial did not announce itself the way the first had. There were no crowds this time, no curious onlookers eager to witness a miracle or a scandal. The room was smaller, the windows higher. The air smelled of dust and resignation. This hearing was not about wonder. It was about control that had begun to fray. Thomas was older now, taller. His shoulders sloped inward as if his body had learned to conserve space. When he walked, there was a slight stiffness in his left hand, the fingers slower to uncurl. The guardian noticed it immediately. "Do not favor it," he murmured. "They will think you weak." Thomas did not adjust. Weakness, he had learned, was a sound others projected. His body merely answered honestly. The judge was new. Younger than the last, sharper-eyed, less inclined to dramatics. Papers were stacked neatly before him. He had read them all. He had read the numbers too, the earnings, the transfers, the accounts that led nowhere. "This court is not here to debate talent," the judge said. "We are here to determine stewardship." Stewardship. A softer word for the same cage. Lawyers spoke in turns, their arguments refined by years of repetition. Thomas's condition. His incapacity. The necessity of guardianship for his own safety. The guardian sat upright, hands folded, nodding at appropriate moments. Charity sat behind Thomas, her presence tolerated but not invited. One lawyer gestured toward Thomas. "The subject cannot speak. He cannot read. He cannot manage finances. To release him would be abandonment." Another countered, "And yet he generates the income in question. Is it reasonable to deny him any agency at all?" The judge leaned back slightly. "Has the subject ever expressed objection to his circumstances?" The guardian answered quickly. "He lacks the capacity for such expression." Thomas's fingers twitched. The judge paused. "Let the record show that the subject is present. I would like him to play." The guardian hesitated. "Is that necessary?" "Yes." The piano was brought in again. Not as polished as before. Slightly out of tune. Thomas felt it immediately, the uneven tension in the strings. He adjusted his bench by a fraction of an inch. "Something simple," the judge said. "Please." Thomas began with a lullaby. It was gentle, sparse. A melody built from repetition and restraint. The room softened almost despite itself. Even the lawyers seemed to breathe easier. Then Thomas introduced a pause. A long one. So long it began to feel like a mistake. Someone shifted. Another cleared his throat. The lullaby resumed, but altered. The notes bent downward, weighted now, carrying something unresolved. Beneath it, Thomas added a faint rhythm, barely audible. A tapping. A waiting. Charity's breath caught. The judge leaned forward. Thomas layered sound carefully. The echo of footsteps in a hallway. A door closing too softly. Coins poured from a pouch and counted twice. The hush that followed an order given and obeyed without question. The music was not loud. It did not need to be. The effect settled slowly like dust after a collapse. The guardian's jaw tightened. "This is inappropriate," Thomas continued. He recreated a voice, not the words but the cadence. The guardian's cadence. Smooth. Certain. Possessive. It threaded through the piece, unmistakable once recognized. A lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "That sounds like..." "Enough," the guardian snapped. Thomas finished the piece with a single sustained note that vibrated until the room seemed to lean toward it. Silence followed. The judge did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "You may step away." Thomas stood slowly. His left hand trembled now, unhidden. The guardian rose. "Your Honor, you see? This is instinct. Imitation. There is no understanding here." The judge studied Thomas for a long moment. "On the contrary," he said, "I believe there is understanding. What I question is whether this court is prepared to recognize it." The ruling came an hour later. Guardianship remained. The money would continue to be managed by others. Thomas would be provided for. His labor would be regulated in his best interest. A compromise that satisfied no one and changed nothing. Outside, Charity took Thomas's hands in hers, pressing them tightly. "You spoke," she whispered. "They heard you." Thomas looked past her, listening to the city. Wagons. Voices. The constant hum of a world that did not pause for justice. The guardian stood nearby, expression controlled but brittle. "You embarrass me again." Thomas did not respond. That night, alone, Thomas did something he had never done before. He did not play. He sat in the dark and listened to his own breathing, to the tremor in his hand, to the faint ringing in his ears that never truly faded. He understood now what the trials were for. Not to hear him, but to ensure he would never be believed. The world had decided that his voice, expressed honestly, was too dangerous to acknowledge. That was acceptable. He no longer needed them to understand. He only needed time. And time, like sound, always accumulates, even when no one is listening. Time did not arrive for Thomas all at once. It seeped. It settled into his joints first, a stiffness that made mornings slower than nights. His left hand, once merely hesitant, began to betray him openly, fingers locking without warning, refusing release. The guardian noticed and said nothing, which was worse than comment. Silence meant calculation. Performances were reduced, then rearranged. Fewer public halls. More private rooms. Parlors where the air was thick with expectation and the men listening leaned forward not with wonder, but with appraisal, as though gauging the last yield of a field already harvested too many times. Thomas played shorter pieces now. Not because he could not do more, but because he chose not to. He understood limits in a way the others did not. He understood that everything breaks eventually if pushed hard enough. Charity aged beside him. Her hair grayed early. Her hands shook when she thought no one watched. She spoke less, not because she had nothing to say, but because words had failed her too often. "They forgetting you," she whispered one evening after a sparsely attended performance. "World always forgets." Thomas listened to the way she said forgetting. The word carried both relief and fear. The guardian did not forget. He tracked every coin still earned, every invitation declined, every doctor's letter warning of exhaustion and decline. He began speaking of Thomas in the past tense even while standing beside him. "He was extraordinary," he told a visitor once. "Still is, of course. But time changes all things." Thomas reproduced that sentence later, perfectly, embedding it inside a gentle melody that made the visitor uneasy without knowing why. The tremors worsened. Some nights, Thomas woke unable to unclench his hands. Other nights, he heard sounds that were not present, echoes of echoes, memories replaying without permission. He learned to sit with them, to let them pass through without resistance. Music, once an escape, became dangerous if not approached carefully. Too much and the noise overwhelmed him. Too little and it pressed inward until his chest tightened. So he chose carefully. He began composing pieces no one requested. Quiet works, sparse, built around absence rather than sound. They frightened the guardian more than the violent ones ever had. "This will not sell," he said sharply. "People want brilliance." Thomas did not respond. The audiences dwindled. The papers stopped printing his name. New wonders arrived. Machines, inventions, louder spectacles that demanded less patience. Thomas became old news. Freedom, when it finally reached him in a meaningful way, arrived disguised as neglect. No one stopped him from choosing when to play anymore. No one demanded long rehearsals. The guardian, tired and increasingly irrelevant, let things slide. Control loosened not from mercy but from disinterest. One afternoon, Thomas walked alone to a small chapel near the edge of town. No one followed him. Inside, the piano was badly out of tune, several keys missing entirely. Thomas smiled faintly. He sat and played anyway. What emerged was fragmented but honest. A life reduced to vibration and memory. The rain on the cabin roof. Charity's voice when she still believed protection was possible. The rhythm of chains heard but never seen. The applause that never felt like approval. He left without finishing. That night he slept deeply for the first time in months. The guardian fell ill soon after. His voice lost its certainty. His hands shook more than Thomas's now. He spoke of legacy, of misunderstandings, of how history would judge him unfairly. Thomas listened. He replayed those confessions softly, not for performance, but for himself. The sound of a man realizing too late that control does not equal permanence. When the guardian died, the news arrived without ceremony. There was no inheritance for Thomas. No apology. No acknowledgement of debt. Charity held his hand at the small service no one attended. "It over?" she whispered. Thomas did not know if that was true. His body continued its slow betrayal. Walking became harder. Playing became intermittent. But his mind remained sharp, filled with stored sound that would never fade. He was allowed to live quietly now. The room. Food. Minimal oversight. Freedom such as it was. Some nights, Thomas still played for himself, softly, shaping memory into something manageable. Other nights, he sat in silence, listening to the world move on without him. He did not feel bitterness. He felt completion. He had returned everything the world gave him exactly as it sounded. What remained was his alone. When Thomas Wiggins died, the notice was brief. A former prodigy. A curiosity of his time. A man of limited understanding. Charity outlived him by only a short while. The money was long gone. The records incomplete. The truth inconvenient. Years later, scholars would argue over what Thomas had been. A genius. A savant. A victim. A miracle. They would debate his silence endlessly. They would miss the simplest answer. Thomas had spoken constantly. The world simply refused to learn how to listen. And in that failure, his final lesson waited, quiet, intact, and undefeated. Years passed the way they always do, quietly, unevenly, without apology. The room Thomas died in was small and unremarkable. No piano stood nearby. No audience waited. The silence that surrounded him at the end was not the enforced silence of contracts and courts, but something gentler, something earned. Charity sat beside the bed, her hand wrapped around his, feeling the faint tremor that never fully left him. Outside, the world continued, wagons passing, voices calling, a city that had learned how to forget what did not serve it. "Rest now," she whispered. Thomas's breathing slowed, each breath spaced farther apart than the last. In those final moments, his mind did what it had always done. It gathered sound. The creak of the floorboard as Charity shifted. The distant toll of a bell marking an hour that no longer mattered. The soft rush of blood in his ears, steady and familiar. Then, nothing. When the breath stopped, the silence did not feel empty. It felt complete. The notice in the paper the next day was short, almost embarrassed by its own existence. Thomas Wiggins, once known for his unusual musical abilities, passed away quietly. No mention of money. No mention of ownership. No mention of how much of the world had passed through him without ever asking permission. Charity lived only a little longer. When she died, there was no one left who remembered Thomas as a child. No one who remembered the cabin by the river, the rain on the roof, the first rhythms tapped by tiny fingers learning the shape of a cruel world. What remained were fragments. Old posters tucked into drawers. Ledgers with missing columns. Newspaper clippings arguing with each other across decades. Accounts that could not agree on whether he had been a miracle or a mistake. Historians came later. They used careful words. Artistic. Savant. Exploited. They debated intent and capacity, argued over whether Thomas had understood his circumstances in any meaningful way. They asked the wrong questions. They asked whether he had known he was enslaved. They asked whether he had known he was famous. They asked whether he had known he was being used. They never asked whether the people who controlled him had known they were being recorded. Because that was the uncomfortable truth buried beneath the myth. Thomas Wiggins had been listening. Not just to music but to power. To fear. To justification. To the sound men make when they believe their voices matter more than another's existence. He returned it all faithfully. Every whip crack hidden in rhythm. Every courtroom lie preserved in cadence. Every confident declaration of ownership woven into melody. The people who heard him felt uneasy for reasons they could not explain. They sensed accusation without language. Memory without mercy. That was why his music frightened them. Not because it was strange, but because it was accurate. Over time, the story softened. The rough edges were filed down. Thomas became a curiosity again, a footnote in musical history stripped of context, stripped of pain. Children learned his name without learning his life. Silence returned. But silence, as Thomas had proven, is never empty. It holds what we refuse to hear. Today, recordings do not exist. No cylinder, no notation, no preserved performance. Only descriptions. Only reactions. Only the consistent admission that something about his music made people uncomfortable in ways they could not explain. That discomfort is the legacy. Not genius alone. Not tragedy alone. But the proof that even in chains, even without words, truth finds a way to speak. Thomas Wiggins did not need language to testify. He needed only attention. And attention once given cannot be taken back. The world moved on. It always does. But beneath the noise of progress, beneath the comfort of forgetting, something still hums. A low, insistent vibration reminding us that history is not silent. We just choose when to listen. What do you think Thomas was really trying to tell the world through his music? Was he a miracle exploited by cruelty, or a witness who turned memory into sound? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story powerful and want more dark historical mysteries that blur the line between history and horror, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes forgotten voices still matter. These stories were buried for a reason. They deserve to be unearthed. They deserve to be heard. I'll see you in the next story.